In the previous lecture, talked about the effects the Transcontinental Railroad had on the country as a whole and on the American West. But now we're going to narrow things down and very specifically look at the big impact it would have on the cattle industry. Now, some of you may think it's odd that here we are, a little more than 2/3 of the way through a course about U.S. westward expansion, and we haven't really talked about cowboys yet. That's just crazy. Well, we're fixing to talk about them now. However, like anything else, when you tell a story, you have to start at the beginning. Now, a lot of the traditions associated with the American cowboy actually started with the Spanish and later Mexican cowboy, the vaquero. There was a cattle industry in New Spain, which of course much later became Mexico, particularly in the southwestern part of North America and the northern part of Mexico. And the means of handling the livestock in a lot of ways was based on practices that dated back to Iberian herdsmen back in Spain, but with a lot of adaptations for new terrain and new circumstances. Now, let's take a moment and talk about terms. Let's start by talking about the places where vaqueros worked. Now, perhaps you've heard the term hacienda, or in English, hacienda. An hacienda was a large estate, usually owned, almost always owned, by upper class people, a don or lord, upper class people who were either from Spain themselves or were of direct Spanish descent but born in the New World. And these estates could probably be, compared to plantations, let's say, in the Old South. Whereas the rancho, from which the English word ranch is derived, was a much, much smaller place, owned by usually a single family, not in part of a huge agricultural enterprise like an hacienda might be, but just sort of like the small farmer who might also have some livestock. Often the ranchos were owned by mestizo people who are folks that were descended from Spanish and indigenous interactions, let's call them. The people who worked on a rancho were sometimes referred to as a ranchero, which could sometimes be shortened to charro, which is a ranch hand, I guess you could say. Sometimes also people who worked on horseback were referred to as a caballero, which comes from the Spanish word for horse, caballo, and also means knight. Just for some context, the Latin root word from which caballero and caballo comes from is the same root word from which we get the word chivalry. So a mounted person. However, someone who worked from horseback and worked specifically with cattle would often be called a vaquero, from the Spanish word vaca, for cow. Because at the time working with livestock was considered a very low-class occupation, initially in the 1600s, vaqueros tended to be African slaves or sometimes indigenous people or mestizo people who, as previously discussed, were those who had sort of mixed heritage between Spanish and indigenous. However, in the course of the 1700s, as the number of mestizo people grew and grew, they eventually tended to make up the vast majority of vaqueros. A lot of terms that have become associated with cowboys over the years reflect the Hispanic origin of the profession. For example, the very word vaquero. Eventually, English-speaking people who moved into the areas mispronounced that as buckaroo. Maybe you've heard that term before. A braided rope in Spanish is a reata, so la reata, a lariat. The word for dungeon, calabozo, became mispronounced by English-speaking people in the area as calaboose for jail. So you better watch out there, buckaroo. You're fixing to head to the calaboose. A noose is a lasso or lasso, right? Now, the cattle industry in New Spain and Old Mexico was not so much geared toward beef. It wasn't geared toward selling the meat of the animals for several reasons. For one thing, not many people ate beef. Pork was preferred fare for most all around North America at the time. But also, you have to consider the fact that these areas we're talking about were sort of the far-flung areas of New Spain and even of Mexico. So if you're trying to sell animals as meat, then we're talking about before there were trains or anything. The place you're going to sell them to has to be close enough that you can walk them there, or close enough that you can slaughter them and get the meat there before it spoils. And there weren't that many places that were that close. So a lot of this trade, and by the way, much of it developed in Southern California, which was part of New Spain, obviously, and Old Mexico. It was geared more toward the hide and tallow trade. So cowhide, alias leather. Once you get that hide tanned, why, it's just as easy as can be to ship it anywhere that you want. What is tallow, though? Tallow is rendered fat, or more specifically, the rendered fat of cattle or sheep. When the exact same product comes from a pig, it's called lard. So what could tallow or rendered fat be used for? All the things lard can be used for. Back in the day, people used to use it like butter and smear it on things, but also you could use it to fry things in. However, one really big use for it in centuries past was to make candles, because tallow was cheaper than wax. Now, if you were a well-to-do hoity-toity type person, you might have wax candles, but most people couldn't afford such a luxury. So tallow candles were sort of the norm. Now, some people couldn't even afford that, and if that's the case, if you were too broke to buy tallow candles or too cheap, you might use your own rendered fat from the animals that you owned and just dip stuff in it, like a rag or a stick, and then set it on fire, and you'd have a slow burn, which was good enough to see where you were going in the dark until you got there. Some people also, in addition to lighting a rag, might use corn shucks, which is why sometimes in old westerns, if someone's getting ready to leave, they might say something like, "I'm fixing to light a shuck," or "light a shuck out of here," or just light out. Now, the cattle that the Spanish brought over from the Old World were Iberian cattle, and over time, so we're talking about the Spanish start bringing cattle over, that's in the 1500s. Over time, Sometimes these cattle might be turned loose to graze on their own or get themselves loose and go graze on their own. And over a couple of centuries, they became semi-wild or plumb wild, and pretty much lived their own lives until they were rounded up. And over a couple of hundred years, they became very hardy, especially along the Texas-Mexico border, where they developed into longhorns. Longhorns were much more resistant to disease than regular cattle. They were able to survive on less food and less water than regular cattle could survive on. On the other hand, they tended to be kind of rangy, no pun intended. The first cattle drives in the Old West, that is to say, the first instances of transporting live cattle in some number for significant distances, was done by the Spanish, specifically the Spanish in Texas. The route taken came to be known as the Opelousas Trail, and then later to the Anglos in Texas, starting in the 1820s and 30s, as the Beef Trail. And it generally followed the route of the Old Spanish Trail. Now, the Old Spanish Trail here in this picture is actually a highway system established in the early 20th century, but it generally followed the old Spanish roads. So in this particular case, they would have started in San Antonio and headed east to New Orleans. Now, bear in mind, after the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in 1763, Spain took over New Orleans from the French, gave it back in the early 1800s. But Louisiana was also a Spanish territory in the late 1700s. A lot of folks don't know that, and probably even more folks don't know that during the American Revolution, Spain sided with the United States. And that's where this guy comes in, the colonial governor of Spanish Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, or I guess in a Spanish accent, Bernardo de Galvez. Anyhow, in 1779, Galvez sent a large amount of supplies eastward to George Washington's army, including a whole lot of gunpowder and other things. He wrote a letter, that is, Galvez did, to the Spanish colonial governor of Tejas, requesting cattle be sent to New Orleans to also then be sent on to the Continental Army. And a bunch of cattle were rounded up in Texas around San Antonio, about 2,000 of them, and were herded eastward to New Orleans, and then from there sent to the U.S. Army. This was the first recorded instance of a cattle drive in the West. You may not think of Louisiana as the West, but Texas certainly qualifies. And after that, it became a fairly regular occurrence of the Spanish taking some cattle to New Orleans, from there to be sent to market, even after New Orleans and Louisiana reverted back briefly to the French, and after that, with the Louisiana Purchase, became part of the United States. These small-scale drives along this trail continued, and they continued as well once Anglo settlers from the United States started moving into the Mexican province of Texas in the 1820s. There were a few isolated incidents or recordings of such drives by Anglo people in the 1820s, but it really picked up when the Republic of Texas was formed in 1836. So the Beef Trail, the Anglos called it, as mentioned before. So they would take the cattle to New Orleans, and from there it would be distributed northward and eastward by steamboat from New Orleans. Sometimes those early Texans didn't take the cattle all the way to New Orleans by land, but rather only so far as Galveston, where they would load them onto boats and take them on to New Orleans by ship. But walking them there, while definitely not easier, definitely was cheaper. So the beef trail tended to be the means by which this was done. Eventually, a northern trail or a northward trail was developed, headed up through Indian Territory, known as the Shawnee Trail. Now, when we're talking about the Shawnee Trail, we're talking about this one right here that I have outlined in blue. Pay no attention to those other trails on the map to the left of that because they didn't exist yet. We'll get around to them in due time. Right now, we're talking about this easternmost northern route, which was sometimes called the Texas Road, sometimes called the Sedalia and Baxter Springs Trail, but most often called the Shawnee Trail. Called the Texas Road because it started in Texas. Called the Sedalia and Baxter Springs Road because it ended there in Sedalia, Missouri, near Kansas City, although there were a couple of branches to St. Joseph and St. Louis. Sedalia had a railroad there, and so from there, the cattle could be sent eastward or northward. Like I said, though, known as the Shawnee Trail primarily, and as you can see, it starts there in south central Texas, taking longhorn, free-ranging longhorn steers from that area in red, gathering them together, going northward, and crossing into Indian Territory in the eastern part of Indian Territory, right near the border of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, and then going up from there, the main branch going into Missouri. It's called the Shawnee Trail because right there where it crosses the Red River into Indian Territory, on the south bank of the Red River, there was a Shawnee village. So they passed right by that on their way to cross the river, and the name just kind of stuck. Now notice that Shawnee Trail there, just as it's leaving Indian Territory and the Cherokee Nation, it divides up into three branches. One goes straight ahead to Sedalia, one goes northeast to St. Louis, and then one, the one that is farther to the west, it goes to St. Joseph, Missouri, good old St. Joe. But it does it by going through the eastern part of Kansas, from south to north, all the way across well, it wasn't a state yet, but all the way across the area. And that became problematic by the 1850s because there were quite a few settlers in eastern Kansas by that time. Many of them had cattle. And when these herds of longhorns passed through Kansas, they left something in their wake. Texas fever. You see, after these Texas herds would pass through an area, the Kansas cattle, which were not longhorns, would often get sick. And if your Kansas cattle caught Texas fever, 9 times out of 10, they did not survive it. So huge numbers of Kansas cattle are dying in the wake of these Texas herds coming through. Kansans believed that the longhorns poisoned the grass, which was not exactly accurate. It wasn't the grass that was poisoned, and it wasn't the longhorns who were poisoned. It was the ticks on them. You see, those Texas ticks, they can still be bad news. But the longhorn steers, or the longhorns, they weren't all steers, the longhorns were so tough and hardy that they were immune to the disease these ticks carried. But as they kind of trekked their way northward through the grasslands of eastern Kansas, and these ticks would drop off of them into the grass. When the regular cattle came along to eat that grass, the ticks would get on them and give them Texas fever, and most likely they would die. Well, whether it was the ticks, which the Kansans didn't really know, or whether it was the cattle, they knew what the main factor was, and that was these Texans bringing these longhorns through their range. So over the course of the 1850s, they got touchier and touchier about that. Sometimes vigilante groups would be there to stop the Texas herds. Sometimes there was even bloodshed, human as well as bovine. And in addition to that, laws got passed limiting or forbidding the passage of any Texas herds through Kansas, which became problematic for Texans who wanted to get their cattle north of Kansas. Now let's stop and think for a moment about why it was that so many Texans were trying to get their cattle to Missouri at this time. Starting in the mid 1840s, like I said, really picking up by the early 1850s. Well, what was going on around that time? Well, starting in the mid 1840s, hundreds of thousands of people were heading west on the Oregon Trail. And where did many of them start that journey? Independence, Missouri. That's where the Oregon Trail officially started. Independence, Missouri, right between Sedalia and St. Joseph. What else was going on around that time? Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in Northern California in 1849, and within a short time, hundreds of thousands of people were headed to California. And where did the overland route to the California gold fields start? The biggest starting off points were Independence, Missouri, and St. Joseph, Missouri. So whether you were headed to the Oregon country or to the gold fields of Northern California, odds are you're going to pass through Independence or St. Joseph. That's where your journey starts. Now your journey may have actually started in New Hampshire or Georgia, but it's when you get to Independence or St. Joe that it really starts. That's where you would equip yourself for all the things you're going to need for that long, arduous overland journey. Now, most folks might have preferred to eat pork, but most folks didn't bring big herds of swine with them. So when you're there in Independence or St. Joe, and there's beef available that's been salted and cured that will last you on this journey, however long it takes, why, you're going to buy it. And the fact is that when a lot of those folks got to California, why, there was beef being made available there too, of the more fresh variety in the form of steaks. And hundreds of thousands of people went there, but the vast majority of them did not get rich, and most of them went back home. And when they did, they carried with them a newly acquired taste for beef. It was over the course of the decade of the 1850s that beef started to be really popular in America as a preferred dish. Then in 1861, as we have discussed in previous lectures, that Civil War thing happened. And when it did, Texas was in the Confederacy. Indian Territory technically was part of the Confederacy, but as we discussed, it was hotly contested. However, Missouri, although a slave state, remained in the Union, and Kansas was very much in the Union. As you can imagine, this made that whole Shawnee Trail thing very problematic. Therefore, throughout the entire Civil War, it was no longer used, because you can't exactly drive all those cattle right through Union territory when you are Confederate. Now, the The Texans did, however, continue initially using that route to New Orleans to get cattle over there to then be sent to the Confederate Army, and that worked for a little while until April 1862, when the Union military, the Navy, and the Army captured New Orleans, which sort of put a halt to New Orleans as a destination as well. Now, shortly after the capture of New Orleans, several naval gunboats, about half a dozen of them, like the one in the upper left there, and that's actually a picture of one of the gunboats in question, about 60 miles west of New Orleans, came across a herd of cattle on shore, about 1,500 head of cattle being driven by Confederate contractors, Texas contractors, to deliver to New Orleans to be used to help feed the Confederate Army. So these contractors were captured, whereupon some of the sailors disembarked, went on shore, and the sailors drove the cattle the rest of the way to New Orleans, while the gunboats cruised along just offshore to protect them. And they were, in fact, attacked several times by Confederates, but the gunboats drove them away. So the last cattle drive to New Orleans during the Civil War was actually finished up by Union sailors, oddly enough. Beef contractors notwithstanding, many, if not most, able-bodied Texas men served in the military during the Civil War. About 70,000 of them in the Confederate Army, and here are some Confederate Texans in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and about 2,000 in the Union Army. And they were away for a good spell. And while they were away, the ranches back home and farms back home were short-handed, as was true all throughout the Confederate States. So not only were there no cattle being sold during this time, there weren't even as many cattle being consumed by the local families because there weren't as many people there, and they weren't being suitably overseen, so that a lot of the cattle that were on ranches sort of wandered off and reproduced in large numbers with very little attrition compared to what normally would have occurred. As a result, a lot of Texas Rangers had experiences similar to that of Charles Goodnight, shown here in a photograph from 1860 when he was 24 years old. Charles Goodnight had become a Texas Ranger as a teenager, spent several years as a ranger, also had his own small ranch. In 1861, joined the Confederate Army, did not go to Gettysburg. In fact, he was part of the Confederate forces there in Texas, protecting Texas from the Comanches during the war, which as the former Texas Ranger he had been doing for years. But actually we mentioned him once before briefly when we talked about Cynthia Ann Parker, the mother of Quanah Parker, who was captured by Texas Rangers in 1860, and he was one of those Rangers. He was in charge of that troop. Anyhow, when he left in 1861, he had about 180 head of cattle on his ranch. When he came back in 1865, he had about 5,000. By the way, we'll be talking a lot more about Charles Goodnight later in this very lecture. But the point for now is that when the various Texans returned home from the war, the Texas ranchers, they had a whole lot of cattle. They had too many cattle. They were all over the place, and what that meant was they became virtually worthless, at least for any local markets, because how are you going to sell your cattle nearby anyhow when everybody has got a bunch of cattle, and then there's a lot of other cattle that don't belong to anybody. All you got to do is go out and find them and round them up. They were selling for maybe $3 or $4 per cow, which was a fraction of what they had been selling for before. So if you're going to do anything about this surplus of cattle, and if you're going to make a living as a rancher, you're going to have to find someplace else to sell them. Now, efforts to get them to New Orleans were made, but that didn't really catch on as much as it once had, because there's just too many of them for that market to sustain. Therefore, gonna have to take them northward. Therefore, efforts were made to once more use that Shawnee Trail that had been so successful in the 1850s. Unfortunately, ranchers in Kansas and in Missouri as well did not want a repeat of that Texas fever situation, so they buckled down in their efforts to prevent any Texas herds from coming into their region, using means both legal and extra legal, with more vigilante groups and more bloodshed. So essentially, the Shawnee Trail was shut down and barely was used anymore. By 1866, cattle were selling for $2 apiece in Texas, and it was estimated there were over 250,000 surplus cattle available around the state. So things are looking kind of dire, but something interesting around that time is taking place in Chicago. In 1865, the huge Union Stockyards was opened in Chicago for penning animals to be prepared for slaughter. And this is bringing us back around to our discussion last lecture about the growth of Chicago and how it became the meat packing center of the country. And part of that, it all ties in with the stuff we were discussing about the Second Industrial Revolution. Remember, part of that was increased immigration and increased urbanization. So cities are starting to have much larger populations. Therefore, if you can sell food to cities, you can make a good living, but you need to produce a lot more of it, right? And that's where this guy on the upper right comes in, Philip Danforth Armour, a New York entrepreneur who'd actually made his fortune when he was in his 20s in the California gold fields, not by mining for gold, but by doing business and selling things to the people who did. 1867, he opens up Armour, and you can see there a photograph of the Armour company there that was taken in 1910. Initially, for the first few years, Armour only dealt with slaughtering and processing pigs. And in fact, they're still best known for their ham. However, after a while, they branched out to beef, and just the early success that they were having with ham kind of spurred on competition, and so there were more and more beef processing places springing up in Chicago, so that while longhorn cattle were selling for, at this point, $2 a head in Texas, they could sell for $40 in Chicago. Enter Jesse Chisholm. Jesse Chisholm was a Cherokee who lived in Indian Territory, originally from Tennessee. He was actually, his father was Scottish and his mother was Cherokee. I think we've discussed how common that was. He was born, I think, in 1805. When he was a young man, he went along with his mother out to Indian Territory, being one of the old settlers that went before the forced march. So he's there in Indian Territory, He was a merchant and a trader, as well as a scout and an interpreter for the army. He spoke English, Spanish, Cherokee, and about a dozen other Native American languages. During the Civil War, he was neutral, and being neutral was a very dangerous thing to be in the Indian nations during the war. So he actually led several people out into the western part of Indian Territory, kind of away from it all. Then later, he became connected with an individual also from Indian Territory, a Lenape or Delaware named Black Beaver. They were actually both around the same age. Black Beaver spoke English and Spanish and also French and about 8 Native American languages. He also served as an interpreter and as a scout for the U.S. Army. In fact, he had led a group of Indian volunteers in the U.S. Army in the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s. Anyhow, Black Beaver, renowned for his scouting abilities, connected up with Jesse Chisholm, who by this time owned several trading posts in Indian Territory. He also owned a trading post just across the Red River Station, and another one near Kansas City, up in Kansas. Well, Chisholm and Black Beaver started using a previously existing Indian trail to go northward from Red River Station all the way up to the area near Kansas City, building up that trail into a road that could handle heavy wagons, mostly initially as a way to deliver goods among his various different trading posts. But within a short time, by 1866-67, they started gathering up some of those surplus longhorn steers in East Texas and moving them from the Red River Station all the way up through Indian Territory into Kansas, where they were able to sell them and get about $10 a head, which was 5 times more than they were fetching in Texas. So this trail came to be known as the Chisholm Trail. You will notice, however, that in this map of the classic Chisholm Trail, it does not go to Kansas City, but it ends in Abilene and Ellsworth. Well, there's a reason for that, and it is also an interesting story. Enter another member of our cast of characters, Joseph McCoy of Illinois. Now, McCoy saw some really good possibilities for business opportunities connected with the meat packing in Chicago and the situation with cattle down in Texas. It was known that those Texas ranchers were by now using the Chisholm Trail to gather up longhorns and bring them up to Kansas to sell them there in Kansas. They were able to avoid the issue of those vigilante groups and the Texas fever business because the trail was just a little bit west of the more heavily settled part of East Kansas, where the Shawnee Trail had come through. Anyhow, McCoy knew that also in 1867, the Kansas Pacific Railroad had come through Kansas. So there's now a railroad in Kansas. You could have cattle from Texas that you could sell in Kansas for $10, but if you could get them up to Chicago, you could sell them for $40. And anybody that was able to make that possible stood to make a fortune. Therefore, Joseph McCoy went down to Kansas to this village called Abilene that initially had just been a stagecoach stop, and he bought 250 acres of land there. On that land, he built this building called the Drover's Hotel. Drover, by the way, is another word for cowboy. You can see it's right near the railroad tracks. Also, right near the Drover's Hotel was established a stockyard by McCoy. He also built a bank and an office building, and he made it known. He spread the word up and down the line for those Texas ranchers that are coming northward on the Chisholm Trail to stop off at Abilene, which was very near the very end of that trail, rather than going all the way to Kansas City. Stop off at Abilene and take advantage of those rail yards there and get a big payday. And indeed, that's what started to happen. This led to, first let me say that McCoy had bragged when he left Chicago that once he set up shop in Kansas, within 10 years, he would ship 200,000 head of cattle to Chicago. Actually, what happened was that within 4 years, he shipped 2 million head of cattle. So, since then, whenever someone makes a big brag, a big boast, and follows through on it, it is said that they are the real McCoy. And, that's not a bad joke on my part. That is actually where that expression comes from. So with all these cattle coming in through Abilene, and then, of course, being shipped north to Chicago, that led to it led to the town growing quite a bit, and it led to Abilene becoming the first cow town, also called cattle towns. These are towns that sprang up along the rail lines that became bustling places of activity. Looks like a quiet day in a cattle town, but what they're really well known for is being kind of wild. Turns out when you have a bunch of cowboys from South Texas trailing a herd for 2 or 3 months, and then finally capping it off with a really big payday, they were not always necessarily the best behaved individuals. Sadly, even though it was Jesse Chisholm who had gotten this ball rolling, he barely got to see it get off the ground. He died of food poisoning in 1868 in his 60s. Well, now let's check back in with Charles Goodnight down in Texas. By 1866, he had acquired a partner, Oliver Loving, and they saw an opportunity, much like McCoy up in Illinois, an opportunity to make some money in the cattle business by taking their cattle outside of Texas. In this case, they were aware of the stuff that we talked about a few lectures ago with the defeat of the Navajos and the Mescalero Apaches and them being removed to the Bosque Redondo area in New Mexico. Well, there's a lot of Native Americans on a reservation that need to be fed. There's also a lot of soldiers that are going to be stationed not only there but in other parts of the region due to the issues with the Apaches. And so the government needs meat, right? So they decided to head out on a trail up to Fort Sumner, New Mexico. And you can see here where they started off there around Fort Concho. They went due west and then took a hard right and went due north up into New Mexico. You may be asking yourself, why didn't they go in a straight line? It would have saved them a lot of traveling, saved a lot of mileage. Well, if they'd gone in a straight line, that would have taken them right across the Llano Estacado, or the Staked Plains. And you may remember from a previous lecture when we discussed Quanah Parker and the Comanches, that was not a good idea at this time. So to avoid the Comanches, they went in this kind of circuitous, roundabout fashion, finally arriving in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. With 18 cowboys, they moved 2,000 head of cattle to New Mexico, where they sold them to the U.S. Army at Fort Sumner, making several $1,000s. The government didn't buy all of them. Loving took the ones that were left over northward to Denver and sold them there, while Goodnight went back to Texas with the money and bought some more cattle, and then turned right around and came back again. It's starting to look like this could be the sort of return investment that a person might be able to keep on making with the need to feed all those Navajos. If you recall, it was virtually, the Bosque Redondo virtually unable to sustain human life, so they're going to have to be bringing food from outside. Speaking of food, Charles Goodnight designed something for this trip that would come to be called a chuck wagon. That's a wagon, you can see it right there, pulled by oxen usually. That was, kind of like a food truck in modern parlance. The cook for the outfit would ride along in that thing, and everything that was needed, flour and so forth, to prepare meals for the cowboys on the way was inside there. So this was the first time that one of those was used, and it was Goodnight's idea. Goodnight brought up a second herd, and he and Loving met back up together about 40 miles south of Fort Sumner at the ranch of John Chisholm, a very prominent rancher in the area, originally from Texas, who happened to be married to Loving's cousin. Goodnight and Chisholm are going to form a partnership, do a lot of things together after this. Chisholm will show back up in our story later when we talk about Billy the Kid. Meanwhile, in '67, Goodnight and Loving brought up a third herd, and this time Loving and one of the cowboys, a guy named Wilson, scouted out way ahead of the main body and were attacked by Comanches. Loving was shot with an arrow, seriously wounded, as he and Wilson took cover in a bend of the Pecos River. Wilson was able to slip past the Comanches and get back to the main herd for help, but when they arrived at the Pecos, Loving was gone. He had made his way up to Fort Sumner, where he was by that point in seriously bad shape as gangrene had set in, and he refused to allow any of his limbs to be amputated to save his life, and so he died. It was a slow death. Goodnight was there with him, sitting at his bedside for 2 weeks until he passed away, and in that time promised Loving that he would return his body to Texas to be buried. So he gave it a temporary burial there in New Mexico, and later the body of Loving was in fact taken back to Texas. Now after this, Goodnight and Chisholm took some herds up, or at least Chisholm participated in providing the herds, all the way up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. By the way, don't confuse John Chisholm with Jesse Chisholm. They're spelled differently. One more person I want to talk about in this section is a cowboy who served with Goodnight and Loving, a guy named Bose Eichard, an African-American man who had been born a slave. He served as a tracker and scout for Goodnight, and sometimes as a traveling bank. On some occasions, Goodnight gave Eichert as much as several $1,000s to carry, figuring that A, he was extremely trustworthy, and B, no one's going to rob this former slave thinking that he has anything. Anyhow, many years later, when Bose Eichert passed away in Texas in 1928, Charles Goodnight paid for a tombstone for him and had this engraved on the stone, quote, Bose Eichert, 1859-1928, served with me 4 years on the Goodnight-Loving Trail, never shirked duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches, splendid behavior. See Goodnight. The story of Bose Eichert is a reminder of a truth that is not very often reflected at all in old Western movies, although in recent decades that has begun to change somewhat. And that is the fact that somewhere between 20 to 25% of working cowboys in the post-Civil War West were probably African American, and another 20 to 25% were Latino, which means only about half of working cowboys were white men, which again, you watch old Westerns and you don't see that reflected at all. Now, this photograph here is of one of the most famous of those black cowboys, Nate Love. I know it's spelled N-A-T, but it was pronounced Nate. Nate Love was born a slave in Davidson County, Tennessee, outside of Nashville, in 1854. When he was 16 years old, he left home and headed west, winding up in Dodge City, where he got work as a cowboy. Later on, in 1872, he moved out to Arizona, where he lived for a long time afterward, and claimed to have met Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Bat Masterson, and others. 1907, he wrote his autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Nate Love, better known in the cattle country as Deadwood Dick, by himself. Now, you may be wondering, how do you get Deadwood Dick from someone named Nate? Well, Deadwood Dick was a fictional character that was popular in dime novels, and Love claimed that because he was such an expert shot, that his friends called him that after the fictional character. The book was a rousing success. Like many a cowboy, it's really hard to say how much of it was truth and how much of it was an imaginative yarn. But there is no denying that he was a working cowboy for many years, and he was only one of many, many African American cowboys in the Old West. Now, if the story of Charles Goodnight, former Texas Ranger, and Oliver Loving, and their fateful cattle drive northward, eventually going all the way to Wyoming, and Loving's injury by under attack by Native Americans, and the gangrene that set in, and the way he died, and the way that Goodnight promised to take his body back to Texas, and the fact that they had this very loyal and competent African American cowboy that served as their scout. If any of that or all of that sounds familiar, it's because it served as the basis for the Pulitzer Prize-winning Larry McMurtry novel Lonesome Dove and the classic TV adaptation of it. If you haven't seen it, you're missing out. And if you haven't read it, you're missing out more. One more cattle trail that I want to talk about is the Great Western Trail that started in 1874. As with most of these, except for Goodnight and Loving, it starts in South Texas. This one went to Dodge City, Kansas. By 1874, the railroad line had extended past Abilene, and Dodge City replaced Abilene as the wide open town in the west. Abilene kind of, well, it's still there, but it lost a lot of its activity due to the growth of Dodge City. So the Great Western Trail went to Dodge and the rail lines there, and also farther north up into Ogallala, Nebraska. So here are all the trails that led up into Kansas, as well as the location of the cow towns that became such hopping places as a result of this activity. We will be talking more about cow towns and the sort of the challenges of keeping the peace in such towns later on when we talk about outlaws and lawmen. So this wraps up our discussion of cattle drives so far as identifying what they were. Our next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about how a cattle drive worked and a bit more about the daily life of cowboys, as well as how the cattle industry progressed as the 1880s rolled around.